So why do you think that China never brought them into the fold of their empire?
So I think there are two main reasons why it never happened.
외국인들은 물론 우리나라 사람들조차 우리 역사에 대해 의문을 표하는 부분이 있습니다. 중국 바로 옆에 있었으면서 어떻게 한 번도 속국이 된 적이 없는가? 그러한 의문에 대한 답을 과거와 현재의 한중 관계와 엮어서 노르웨이 출신의 사학자 오드 아르네 베스타가 하버드에서 강의를 했는데요. 그는 강의 내용들을 정리해 제국과 이로운 민족이라는 제목으로 책을 냈습니다. 지금부터 보여드릴 인터뷰 영상은 과거부터 현재까지의 한국과 중국 간 관계와 그 과정에서 어떻게 한국이 독립을 유지할 수 있었는지에 대한 베스타 교수의 견해를 담고 있는데요. 그가 본 한국과 중국의 역사는 어떤 모습이었을까요?
Welcome, Professor Westad.
It's great to be here.
So let's begin with an overview of the book. Tell us about it.
So this is a book that started as a set of lectures that I gave at Harvard 2 years ago, where I tried to provide an overview of the relationship between China and Korea over a long period of time, to sort of try to get to the essence of what that relationship is like. So it started very much from the idea of the centrality, the significance of that particular relationship today. I think whatever happens in the future, relations between China and Korea are going to be pretty important for the international community. And then I developed it from there. So this was actually a case of working backwards in history. So starting with my interest in the contemporary relationship and then working back. And it ended up being a book much more about history than about the contemporary situation. But hopefully, you know, it will be an opportunity to learn from that past.
Okay, and so you have done a lot of work on Asia specifically. Why Korea and China? What led you to focus on that relationship?
So two things really. I mean, one I mentioned already. It's the contemporary significance of that relationship. So everyone now is preoccupied what's going to happen on the Korean Peninsula. We are concerned about the North Korean nuclear program and where that would be heading. We're concerned in general about security relationships in Northeast Asia. So that was one starting point for this. And of course, China is by far the most significant neighbor of Korea. But then there was also a preoccupation with how this has worked through history. So Korea is a small country, bordering a country that for most of its existence has been an empire, China in its various imperial incarnations.
Right.
And I was quite eager to try to find out a bit more about how that relationship had worked. So for instance, why was Korea never incorporated into the Chinese empire? Why was it always distinct? Why did it have a very clear, specific identification of being outside of the empire? That's an interesting question, I think, in the broad sense.
Yes, yes. So how did you do the research?
So this is a book where I started by giving the lectures, and then I figured out how little I actually knew about much of this. So then I did what I usually do when I write a book. I go back to reading, and in this case, mainly what others have written about this, people who know the different periods of the Sino-Korean relationship much better than what I do. For a relatively brief period which deals with the early 20th century, I also looked at some of the document collections that are available. And then I spoke to a lot of people about their work on the past, but also people who are dealing with Sino-Korean relations today. So I spoke with policymakers and officials in Seoul and in Beijing. And I also gave an early version of these lectures in both of the capitals, so both in Beijing and Seoul, and had the reaction from their scholars and their officials to this. So that was the sort of genesis of the book. And then I went back to writing and hopefully did something that was slightly different from what it was when I first presented the lectures.
Okay, and so when you gave your presentations, your lectures in China and Korea, and also when you were doing the research in general, did you come across anything, were you asked anything that surprised you, that you didn't expect?
Oh, a lot. I mean, I think particularly surprising perhaps today, I mean, when you think about the relationship now between China and Korea, is the mutual preoccupation that people from these two countries have of each other. So China being a big country, a bit like the United States, right? You ask people about relations with other countries, and it's, you know, it's somewhere there, but it's not central to their heart. It's not part of the core identity of who they are. For many Chinese, Korea is a little bit different because it has been a neighbor for China for millennia. It is so close that young Chinese now who watch South Korean television series of various sorts. Their reaction is, these people are foreign, but they're almost like us.
Right.
Right? And that preoccupation, I think, was a bit surprising to me, how close that relationship is seen as being. And on the Korean side, in terms of Chinese culture and the origins, the common origins, which I write quite a bit about in the book, of Chinese and Korean culture.
Okay, so let's talk about how how Korea's relationship with China did develop over the course of 600 years and how it did remain separate from it.
Right. So this book starts in the late 14th century. So it starts when China gets a new empire, the Ming, which comes in and take over and sets up a new Chinese state after the fall of the Mongol World Empire. And at the same time, but for somewhat different reasons, Korea also gets a new state formation, a new kingdom called the Joseon. And it's very interesting that this happens roughly at the same time. I think much of that has to do with these bigger changes. I already mentioned the collapse of the Mongol Empire, probably also changes that happens in the broader East Asian region in terms of trade, in terms of environment, a lot of other things that are happening. But I then try to follow the development of these two states and how they influence each other and what the relationship between them is. And I focus in particular for that early period on the cultural relationship. So both of these two states base themselves on Confucian, or particularly Neo-Confucian thinking. So the renovation of a set of ideas that came out of China more than 2,000 years ago. And that reinvigoration of these ideas. And these ideas are that, family is very important. The state is very important. The state is the big family, that everyone is looking at in terms of creating a good society and good lives. Very hierarchical, very didactic. In both societies, this gets an enormous influence through the activities of the state, but also because it's embraced by large numbers, at least of the elite population in both countries. So that's, in a way, the starting point, the formative era of this early modern relationship between China and Korea. And this is one of those points that I think are really important for understanding the relationship today. That common heritage, which of course the whole region shares to some extent, but it's particularly intense between China and Korea.
So why do you think that China never brought them into the fold of their empire?
So I think there are two main reasons why it never happened. The first one, which I explore in the book, is the development of what you could, with a slightly anachronistic term, call Korean nationalism. So at least, this is my argument in the book, at least from the late 16th century, there is a very clear Korean identity, which is connected to the culture as it had developed during the Ming in China, but is still separate from it. And it comes pretty close, I argue, building on the work of historians of Korea that have worked on this before, very close to what in the 19th century and early 20th century in Europe you would call a nation. That's quite unique in many ways, but that identity is important. And then secondly, I think on the Ming side and later on the Qing Empire that took over from the Ming in the early 17th century, there was this idea of Korea as a symbolic ally, as a model ally in a way, a model vassal, a state that aligned itself with whatever power was in control of China. And therefore had, to some extent, earned the right to be separate from it. It didn't have to be disciplined. It didn't have to be brought into the empire and told by the emperor, stop misbehaving, live like us. Because in a way, they already did that.
Right. Was there a certain level of respect, do you think, between the two countries?
I think there was a great deal of respect. Now, of course, on the Korean side, on the Joseon side, one always had to be very careful. Living next to an empire is always difficult and sometimes very dangerous. And I think the Korean leaders during the Joseon state developed a number of ideas about how they could handle that relationship with the Chinese empires, with the Ming and later on the Qing. Always be respectful, but also always be very cautious with regard to how you dealt with the empire next door. For instance, the the Koreans became masters of knowing much more about the empire than the empire knew about them.
Wow.
They were extremely good at taking advantage of the ritual visits that they carried out, the so-called tribute missions, to Beijing, figuring out what was important for the empire, what was discussed there. They were, you could put it in modern terms, you could say they were really good at intelligence work. And all of this was reported back to Korea, and therefore the Korean kings knew how to react when different kinds of initiatives came out of the Chinese side.
So, is there anything over the course of the 600 years that we've learned through history that can help with today's situation, do you think?
I hope there's quite a bit. I mean, I hope that the book will contribute to that in a way. I mean, first and foremost, the understanding, as we've touched upon already, of just how hard it is to live next door to one of the world's megastates. I mean, how you handle that. And I think this is a challenge today for both parts of Korea, both north and south, in terms of developing, especially as China rises in terms of international affairs and become more significant on a global scale. They have to figure out, how do we deal with that relationship? How do we deal with it in terms of the economic aspects, the political aspects, the military strategic aspects, you know, or even the cultural aspects.
Sure.
And on this, I think there is a great deal of learning that can be had from history. You have to be very careful, very cautious in terms of how you do it. But on the other hand, you cannot live a life that is based on excluding the empire that is next door. It has to be brought in. So one of the big lessons, I think, from history is that there won't be a solution to the division of Korea, which I think is what is needed in order to avoid the kind of security dilemma that we have at the moment.
데스타 교수 말처럼 우리는 앞으로도 좋든 싫든 중국이라는 거대 국가와의 관계를 어떻게 해야 할지 고민해야 하는데요. 2000년이 넘는 세월 동안 중국으로부터 독립을 유지해왔던 우리 조상들의 지혜에 그의 답이 있을지도 모르겠습니다. 오늘 영상은 여기서 마치겠습니다. 시청해주셔서 감사합니다.